Welcome back, dear listener, to another episode of Rachnaye and Rachnakar. Today, we have the honor of diving into the world of children's literature with award winning and well published author Shanthini Govindan. With over 50 books to her name, she has left an indelible mark on children's storytelling. From poetry to picture book and short stories that resonates with all ages, and her creations have been celebrated across the globe. So let's welcome Santhini Govindan. Thank you so much, ma'am. Thank you so much for joining. It's our privilege to have you in this conversation. So let's start. In beginning, I would like to ask that your journey of literature is remarkable. With more than 50 books you have written for children's, and uh, all these things comes directly from your heart. So could you share with us a glimpse of how your love for storytelling evolved into this incredible body of work?
Thank you so much. Thank you for inviting me. It's my pleasure also to be here and to talk to you and hopefully to talk to all your readers and the children who read your books and writers and other supporters.
Thank you.
So my journey, I as a young girl, I never wanted to be anything other than a writer. Children sometimes have ambitions to be an astronaut or an engine driver or a movie star, but I never wanted to be anything other than a writer. I was always fascinated with the written word and with the idea of creating characters and stories. I was always a voracious reader and was immersed in writing and reading books and creating ideas in my head. So I started writing at a very young age, and it was always in my mind this was going to be the profession that I would follow. So, and as I grew up, I took a master's degree in English literature, read a lot, but I wasn't very, there was no plan that I would write for children. So that I sort of meandered into it when I had my own little children. When my first son was born, I told him a story. I entered that story into a picture book competition conducted by the writers of children's books in CBT in Delhi. Won a prize, and that was a great encouragement for me. For many years, I kept that letter, that told me that I had won a prize in the CBT competition. So that was the beginning. And then from then on, with every book that I wrote, it was an encouragement. Then I found there were readers, there were people who were interested in what I wrote. I must tell you, I never really planned. It was not a planned career in that way. It just grew. It just happened because in between I was also a mother. I had to look after a family. So in between I would write. So even today I do not have the routine of like sitting down at the table and writing. I write everything in my head first. And the act of putting it down on the computer or on paper is the very last thing. Because I never had the time when I was a young person, young mother, a student, to sit for hours. I had to think when I was on the go. And so that was how I started writing. And then, of course, I wrote purely as recreational reading. But it so happened that one of my publishers, Madhuban Books, she published one of my books of poems and stories. And then she asked me, have you ever thought of doing academic books? And I hadn't. And I was very averse to doing it because somehow, even today, authors feel that recreational literature is top notch and maybe academic literature and readers are not so. So I was reluctant, but she persuaded me. Then I told her that you must give me a free hand and I will, tailor the questions and the stories as I think fit. which was very democratic. She said yes. So I felt that all the textbooks at that time had answers that were yes and no. And I feel that many times children, when they make a wrong answer, they feel very, it's upsetting if you make two wrong answers. So I said I'm going to have a few questions which do not have a right and a wrong. It's going to be a question where the child can give his or her opinion. So she said, okay, we will go with it. And that was my first academic book, books readers. It was 2009. Um, Even now it is public, it's still in print.
Yes.
After that, I have written for almost every important academic publisher in India.
Yes.
So that was a stepping stone. And then I came to know that I realized that when I went for literary festivals, that for many children, average child in India, from a middle class or lower middle class family, there is no money to buy library books, recreational books. So sometimes their first and maybe their only introduction to literature is what they read in their school textbooks. So it's very important that those stories and poems convey the right positive message, that they're entertaining, they are informative, but at the same time, they teach children the right values. So right now, I at least 4 or 5 books a year I do for academic publishers and selection of stories and poems. Although I still love to do my recreational reading very much. Recreational reading for children. A lot of the stories that I've written as recreational reading are also now being taken by academic publishers as books. They have adapted it, maybe shortened it, and used them in the textbooks. So,
Wonderful.
yeah.
So, your books have found their way into the countless young hearts, and many are even, as you said, are part of educational tools in schools across India. So,
Yes.
could you tell us about the theme and messages you often weave into your stories?
I think that, there are so many messages, and to some extent, it depends on what, I'm working on. For example, I did get a fellowship from the government of India to write historical fiction for children. And one of the stories was based in Mughal India. And then when I was doing a lot of research on Emperor Akbar, I found that even though Emperor Akbar was very, he was a good warrior, he was very interested in many subjects, he could not read. He was illiterate. And so I was very surprised because I don't think there was ever any doubt about Emperor Akbar's intelligence. He was a very bright man. But why was it that he couldn't read? He had a prodigious memory. And then, after a lot of research, I found out that Emperor Akbar was dyslexic. He had dyslexia. He couldn't read. And at that time, there was no way. Now dyslexia is a very treatable condition, and children who have dyslexia are taught how to read. But during Akbar's time, he had to find his own way, so he would memorize things. So I became so interested in dyslexia. I wrote a fiction book on dyslexia, and it won a prize. It became an award-winning book in the Children's Book Trust, because I felt there are many children and parents who don't know what dyslexia is. The children are told, they feel that they are stupid. They don't know that it's a treatable condition. Then when I did the research, I found that there are many famous people also who have had dyslexia but who have got over it. So that was one. So sometimes it's something that I'm reading. A lot of my work has the theme of the wind, because I've always been fascinated by the wind. So there are poems and there are stories about the wind. And then there are many stories about day-to-day conditions. Like one of my stories, which is I wrote for CBT, which is now used as a text, is Children Are Afraid of the Dark. of the night.
Yes.
So I had based a story on that, and somehow it found its way into. It was not a book I had edited, but some of the other, I think, people who were looking into academic books selected it, and it's doing very well. And I think it comforts children to know that they are not alone. There are others also who are afraid of the dark.
Yes.
So I think I try to use common themes, but I'm very careful to make my stories gender sensitive because I feel that girl children need a leg up, and I do not espouse any kind of violence, either verbal violence or physical violence, portraying it. I try to water it down because I think we have enough of violence in our world without my bringing in more in a story.
It's truly admirable. Among your many accomplishments, your association with Chanda Mama magazine was a very wonderful thing and it stands out. So, could you tell us about your role in contributing to the magazine and your experiencing in nurturing historical fiction and mythology?
Yes, so I was with Chanda Mama for 2 years.
Oh.
That was towards the end of the tenure, and unfortunately, during my time with Chanda Mama, it was sold. The magazine was sold by the original owners to another company, and there was some problem, and unfortunately, it no longer exists. But when I joined, so I was asked to invited to write a poem or a column on historical fiction, one on folk tales, both Indian and international, and one on mythology, on Indian mythology. The mythology was really a problem for me because there were so many stories, common stories that had already been covered in Chanda Mama. So I had to really look very hard to find stories that were interesting but that had not already been covered because all the common ones have been covered. So in this process, I learned a lot about mythology, and it's Indian mythology is so imaginative and so interesting, and the characters and even the asuras are so interesting. So and then I had the on historical fiction. So even there we had to do research and find out historical characters that would appeal to children. Some of them were challenging. They asked me to write a column on Genghis Khan, and they said, but there should be no violence, which was a bit hard because Genghis Khan is known to be. But when I started doing the research, and this was a lesson for me, there is always a humane side to everybody, even to Genghis Khan. And that was the learning that I got. That maybe history portrays everyone in one light, but when you dig hard, you will find there is another side to every person also. So it was a very interesting. So for 2 years, unfortunately, those stories are, some of them are still online, but many of them are, lost for, I mean, because the magazine is no longer in print. Although I do still get requests from readers who have read some story or the other, and they ask me, can you send us a copy? Especially on Twitter, I get a lot of that.
We also your some of stories are on your website as well.
Yes, yes, yes,
So your dedication for writing and your dedication for nurturing young minds extend beyond your writing. You are
yes.
conducting workshops for children and even taught creative writing to them in Mumbai University.
That's right, yes.
So, how do you see these interactions with impact the next generation of writers and storytellers?
See, the creative writing classes that I conduct, they are for different levels. I have taught, as you said, at the university level, and I have taught creative writing from
Children.
classes as small as grade 1 and 2, where they are not really able to write, but they have such ideas and they are so interested in uh, being given an opportunity to write or to expand their own ideas. So I find that the smaller children, they are the most responsive, and they listen avidly, and they have no inhibitions about speaking out whatever they think. So many times parents, they put the children into the creative writing class. Sometimes the children do have an interest in writing, but most of the time it is just as an activity to fill up the time. So I always try to make the children interested, so that it is not just another activity to fill up the time. And I always tell children, don't copy what, bring a little of yourself into the story. So poetry is something that children love. I have found that every time I have a poetry writing class, they adore it because children are naturally have a sense of rhythm and a love for music. So I find the poetry writing classes go very well. Unfortunately, our Indian publishers do not publish much of poetry or very little poetry for children. My most of my poems have been taken by academic publishers, and they are widely used in the academic books. So I think that creative writing classes help children to be communicative, to talk a little more about their own ideas.
And more
And
imaginative.
yes, exactly. And I always tell them, you don't have to become a writer, but whatever profession you follow, you will be a success if you are a good communicator. So creative writing helps you to communicate clearly and in an interesting way.
Yes, communication is the key.
Exactly.
So, your accolades include prestigious fellowship and international recognition as well. Can you share with us your thoughts on being invited as the first Indian writer to the Highlights Foundation Writer Workshop in US?
Yes, so this was many years ago, and Highlights is a was a very well known children's magazine, and they have this workshop for children's book writers. So it was an immersive experience. It was for 1 week. By the time I won this award, I was already a published writer, and I had already sort of established myself in India. Why I'm telling you this is because when I went to the US, many people ask me, so you are now like, you have already established yourself. Do you think that if you had got this fellowship before, that you would have been more successful? And I was very truthful. I said, absolutely not. Ignorance is bliss sometimes. If I had got this fellowship when I was just setting out, I would have been so frightened and nervous to realize all the things that I had no idea about. And I probably would have abandoned the idea of being a writer. The fact that I had no idea, and at that time in India, publishing was at a very nascent stage. There was no internet. So we were just blundering on as we liked. So if I had known that, oh, there are this many things that I don't know, I would have been a bit scared. By the time I went, I had already established myself as a writer, and I knew what I could do and what I could not do. But I did get many useful insights from going to Chautauqua in New York, especially about the importance of reading your own work again and again, and then editing it and polishing it, and the importance of, submitting to the correct market.
Correct.
That time, but I must tell you, India was in a different place. Children's book writing was in a different place.
Correct.
Now, I would say that um, in the children's book market in India is not in the nascent stage anymore. It's well,
Yes.
as India is now taking center stage. I hope even the children's book writers will do the same.
Yes. Recently, you got prize in Tata's Parag list of
Yes,
something
that was
massive.
a story that it was one. It was a book. of
Anthology book.
apology, yes, and mine was one of the stories, and I think it was published by CBT. And I had no idea. Then one day when the I saw some of my writer friends who were also contributed to the book said, "Oh, it has come in the parag." So we were very happy. That was a book of young adult stories, and the story that I had written was based on my own experience. My son went to IIT, and I remember when he was studying for IIT, neither myself or my husband we pushed him to go to IIT. In fact, I was rather nervous of all these hours of studying, and but there were other parents who wanted their children to go to IIT even though they had no interest. And that is unfortunately an Indian habit. If you want to put your ambitions on your children, and that sometimes causes a trauma. So that was the theme of my story, based on what I had observed. And I'm so glad that the book won that award, because that means more people will read, and I hope many parents will realize that each child comes with his or her own interests. So even if we are a doctor, doesn't mean our child has to be or wants to be a doctor.
Absolutely.
Like I'm a writer, neither of my children is wanting to be a writer. So each one has their own interest.
I We would like to know that what advice would you give to aspiring authors, especially those interested in children's literature?
Read all you can and write all you can. It's a difficult to, sometimes it takes years. I have had stories that I have written many years ago that have not been published, and then I take it out again and I rework the whole story, and then it's taken by a publisher. So writing is a hard, difficult journey, especially in India. I do not think that it is possible, or I'm pretty sure it's not possible to, if you need an income, you cannot live by writing children's literature. You need to do something else. You might have to do another job. However, it is a very rewarding profession, especially if you like children. They are the most interesting. I feel my readers are the most interesting people in the world. The feedback that I get, they are very honest. Sometimes I try out stories. I have a small group of children, since my own children are grown up. And the moment I start reading, if their attention wanders, sometimes they'll tell me it's a very boring story. But if they're captivated and they ask questions, then I know that I'm on the right track. So children are very truthful. When I buy a book, somebody recommends it, even if the first 20 or 30 pages is boring, I determinedly read it because I've spent the money and people have said that it's a good book. A child will never do that. If the first page is boring, they'll throw the book and say, I don't like this book. So you have to hook your audience, right from the first paragraph, which is very difficult. And you have to make sure that your writing is interesting and tight, and that there is no boring bits in between. In an adult book, there may be a few pages that are dull to pad up the story, but a child will not want to waste time like that. A child wants everything to be interesting because their attention span is also less.
Yes.
So
Yeah, you are absolutely correct in every respect of children's psychology and
yeah.
their mental status. Thank you so much, ma'am, for sharing your insights, your experiences, and wisdom with us. Your journey is truly inspiring, and your contribution to children's literature is invaluable. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.